Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about trauma and memory and how these two things interplay together. So we're going to be covering topics like PTSD, implicit and explicit memory, conscious and unconscious, somatic memory, going over how the different parts of the brain are interacting with the way that we store memory and remember memory. We're going to talk about false memory as well, and suppressed or repressed memory. So before you watch this video, if you don't understand what trauma is, I really encourage you to go over and watch my video titled What is Trauma? Then I would encourage you to watch How Fragmentation Affects You or Teal Swan's video Fragmentation, the Worldwide Disease. The reason why I want you to watch the video on fragmentation is because trauma memories are stored differently from regular memories. The trauma memory is actually fragmented, which means that the sight is stored separate from the smell, is stored separate from the sound, is stored separate from the physical sensations. And because the psyche is being fragmented between the aspects of them that were vulnerable and the aspects that kept them safe, that means that these different components of memory are also stored separately in these different parts. And this is important when we're talking about consciously remembering something versus subconsciously remembering something. So before we get into that, we're just going to talk about what happens when you experience trauma, what happens in the body. Because what is happening in the body is the body's somatic reaction. And that is very, very important when we talk about the way that memory is created, okay? So often we like to think that memory is stored in the brain, but your memory is actually stored at a cellular and somatic or physical level as well, meaning that your body is not only storing the actual traumatic event itself, but it's storing the physiological response that your body created at the time of that traumatic event. And why is that? It does that through association so that in the future, if you have a similar stimulus, your body can recognize, oh, this is a time when I need to do fight or flight or freeze. So it's basically like a shortcut way of storing certain stimulus with certain physiological response, which your body makes mean certain things. So three really important components of the brain associated with memory and trauma are the amygdala, the cerebellum, brainstem, and the hypothalamus and thalamus. The amygdala processes sensory threat and sends output to the other brain sites. The hypothalamus then releases stress hormones, and the brainstem is responsible for automatic behaviors and alertness like immobility or mobility. So there's two main roads that your brain takes when you have a distressing event, the high road and the low road. The low road is your brain's automatic, unconscious, right there, it's a very general response. What it's doing is it's taking the sensory information provided to the amygdala via the thalamus, and it's making very blanket judgments about rapid, immediate reactions. So that might look like freeze. And then what happens is the high road. So like, let's say a gun goes off and you hear a bang. The low road is going to be the initial response that your body has to freeze. The high road is a more specific approach. So basically when your brain can scan and then decide, okay, I'm either going to hide or run, how am I going to escape? So it's able to assess the situation in more detail and then create an escape plan or some way to make yourself safe. And the high road is routed through the cortical sensory areas of the brain. Okay, so maybe you don't really care about the parts of the brain, but the next chunk we're going to get into is really juicy. So we've got two different kinds of memory. We have explicit memory or declarative memory, which is the memory that you can consciously recall. And then we have implicit memory, which is an unconscious memory that you're not aware of. Implicit memory is basically called threat conditioning. So what's interesting is that if you look at people who have gone through cult trauma or cult ritual abuse, what these people are doing is they're capitalizing on implicit memory, which is essentially Pavlov's response. So you're programming the dog to salivate when it hears the sound of a bell. Every time the scientist would ring the bell, the dog would get a juicy steak. Eventually, it was simply the sound of the bell that would cause the dog to salivate because of the association between these two things. So what happens with programming is that you can basically bypass the memory altogether and just create the association. So the person doesn't have a conscious awareness of the memory itself, but they know that every time they see the color purple, they have this kind of response. And for programmers, for example, it benefits them because they could program a specific color into you that every time you see that color, it actually further instills other programs. And if it's a color that you can't get away from, for example, like blue, the sky is blue, or green because the grass is green, you can see where that would create some issues for somebody, especially if they don't have an actual memory of why they're having this association. It's the same thing with shock and an image. So if you shock somebody with an electroshock convulse thing, and that's really scientific, and you show them an image, eventually all they have to do is see the image and their body will respond as if they're being shocked. Their physiological response will be the same. So why is this important? Because triggers are this. Triggers are physiological responses that have been programmed into us. And because trauma memories are fragmented, you might not understand why you're being triggered. In most cases, you won't. So you might get a smell of something that reminds you of a specific time, but all you get is the physiological response, or maybe the emotion, or maybe a flash of an image, but you're not getting the complete picture. And that's why, which I'm going to get into in a second, completion process and things like that are so important. And this is really, really about to blow your mind what I'm going to say right now. So what we know is that reactivated memories can actually be altered, which is going to lead us into false memory and the susceptibility of being able to alter someone's perception of a memory, because we also understand that children are very susceptible to suggestibility. So if they have something that happened and then you give them new information, even adults, if they have a memory and you give somebody a new piece of information, it will actually alter the original memory for them, as well as being able to suggest certain things to a person, or as a psychologist perhaps asking leading questions to someone, which will cause them to have not necessarily a totally false memory, but it will lead them into a direction that maybe isn't authentically accurate. We know that human memory is incredibly fallible. This is part of the reason why eyewitness testimonies are some of the weakest in court cases. So before I talk more about repressed and suppressed memories and false memory, I want to really drive home this point about the ability to modify a reactivated memory. Because when we put somebody into a triggered space, whether that's consciously or unconsciously, their body's just physical reaction, they're actually having electrical activation of the original neural pathways and a reactivation of the cellular memory. What this means is that we basically have the person exactly where they were physiologically when that thing happened. Now, the benefit of this is that not only is this new place, like if we're putting, as a practitioner, if we're putting somebody or you're putting yourself back into that activated space, but you're doing it in the comfort of your own home, let's say with a loving practitioner or a loving friend or a loving spouse, not only is your amygdala getting the new signal that, wait, I'm experiencing this physiological reaction, but it's happening in a safe environment, you're already starting to recode what's happening. You're recoding the memory. On top of that, we can actually reorganize the trauma experience, which is literally what we're doing in completion process. We are going back and we're meeting the needs that were not met. We're actually altering the memory so that we change the neural pathways and the intracellular processes that are happening within the person. And it might seem like, oh, well, it's not possible for me to change the memory. But if your physiology is activated, And then your amygdala is getting this new experience. You can actually rewire your brain and unwire these trigger activation or this trigger association. So if it's possible to reorganize a trauma memory in a safe environment, think about what recalling that memory in an unsafe environment can do. This is how we get re-traumatization. So let's say you're somebody who is a rape victim, and then the police show up and you're required to give your statement about what happened in very graphic detail, but it's happening in a very stressed out environment. That can actually create a re-traumatization where your physiology is forced to go through the same distress but all over again, and it's actually like reconsolidating that memory and sort of like compacting it or compounding that initial trauma even more. Something else I want to briefly discuss is something that was recently brought to my attention called infantile amnesia. Now, this is the belief that before a certain age, we're not capable of storing memory. And I'm going to tell you that that's total and complete bullshit. Just because you don't consciously remember something doesn't mean you don't subconsciously remember it. So, right, we know human memory is fallible, right? You're not a tape recorder that's perfectly recording all events happening in your life. But your subconscious mind is like a tape recorder. The problem is that most of that stuff becomes suppressed and we don't have conscious access to that. Why is that? Because if you were to consciously remember every single terrible, traumatic thing that happened to you, you wouldn't be able to function. So your subconscious essentially acts as a container for these things so that you can continue to consciously live your life. The problem is that you're not consciously living your life, right? Because all this subconscious stuff that's stuffed away in there is continuing to play out in your external reality. It's my opinion that spreading things like infantile amnesia is incredibly dangerous, right? Because if we have this idea that a child or an infant isn't going to remember something, then we can do things like circumcision, we can do things like yelling or screaming or fighting in front of a baby as long as we think that they're not going to remember it, but they do, and it does affect them. So regardless of whether somebody consciously remembers something, that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it actually affects them as a person. So that's really the only thing that I'm interested in. Does it affect the person or does it not affect the person, regardless of whether they ever get that memory back or not? But it's also my belief that as a multidimensional being, you do have access to all memories, not only within this universe, if you can expand your consciousness or expand your perspective enough, but also from your entire life. So that means you actually do have access to gestational trauma, gestational memories, womb trauma, womb memories, infancy, all of those things. And I know that because I've worked with dozens and dozens and dozens of clients and done hundreds of sessions with people where we're going back to crib trauma, womb trauma. And then this kind of brings us into my next point, which is about false memory or suppressed memory. It is really of very little interest to me whether or not a memory that someone has is accurate or inaccurate. When I work with people and a memory comes up, I never question that memory and I never have them question that memory. You'll find that in a lot of cases, the only time that false memory ever becomes an issue is when that memory directly contradicts something that other family members or friends or people with a different perspective or a different perceptual reality have an issue digesting. So let's say that you start having repressed memories come up of being molested when you were 4 years old. Now, if that stands to potentially cause other people to have to own shame or own a reality that they're not willing to own, then it's more likely that you're going to be told that that's not true, that that didn't actually happen to you. It's of very little interest to me whether or not those things did or did not happen to that person when I'm working with them. If a memory comes up, we work with the memory as if it is real. Why do we do that? Because that person's subconscious mind would not be offering that thing up unless it was a necessary part of their healing process. So it doesn't really matter if it's real or not. It's perceptually real for them, and so we work with it. that's part of their healing process. It doesn't matter to me. Sure, the memory that you remember might not be exactly what happened, but it doesn't really matter because it's your perceptual reality that matters. That's what we're dealing with. And additionally, it's pretty uncommon, like almost never, unless you're dealing with a sociopath or a psychopath, that somebody's going to just completely invent an entirely false memory, right? It's probably, if it's not accurate, it's close, or it's the same feeling. It's the same feeling that person had at that time. It's pretty rare that somebody will just invent something that never happened, right? Unless they're consciously manipulating you in some way. Something else I want to talk about is this neuroplasticity and how trauma does have an effect on the brain, right? It's actually changing the way that your neurons are wiring and firing together. So what happens then when we have somebody like a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who mom and dad thinks they've got bipolar, there's something wrong with them, they do a brain scan, and their neurons are wired and fired differently than maybe your typical person. So what science would like you to believe, so that you can medicate yourself, is that your brain is just like that. You were born that way. So we need to give you medication so that you can fix this neurochemical and neurological miswiring and hormonal disruption. Okay, but that's not what's happening. It's the other way around. So it's the trauma that actually created that change in the brain, which means that through healing modalities, we can change it back. We can alter your brain. That's what neuroplasticity is. The next thing I want to talk about is PTSD. So this is a perfect example of suppressed memory, right? There's lots of things that people that come back from war consciously remember. And then what's interesting is that we don't see PTSD effects happening until they return home, until the amygdala and the body and the brain all feels like it's safe. Because as soon as you're safe, that's when the being starts kicking up these flashbacks and starts kicking up what it's trying to do, which is process what happened to it. And the reason that this is so different is because with PTSD flashbacks, it's not that the person is remembering what happened to them, they're actually reliving it. Because their being didn't complete the cycle of trauma or complete the cycle of the actual event itself, their body keeps reliving the experience in an attempt to heal or complete that cycle. And this ties in to my next point, which is about hallucinations, auditory and visual, that we see with people on both the schizophrenic and bipolar spectrum. Now, without going super deep into what creates these kinds of adaptations, I can tell you that if you are ever with somebody, or if you are ever someone who's experiencing auditory hallucinations, for example, listen to those voices. The understanding I gained from Teal Swan about schizophrenia is that the auditory aspect of the memory is stored closer to the conscious mind than, let's say, the emotion or the visual, which is usually the case for the average person. So when the average person gets triggered, they might have a feeling state, but they don't understand why they're being triggered, or they might get a flash of a visual. In the case of somebody who's schizophrenic, what they're getting is the auditory aspects of a memory. This is why it's important that they listen to these voices. So in these cases, it's the being and the psyche's most intelligent way of trying to get that person to actually heal by making it so that they can't quiet it anymore, because it's so suppressed and the splits are so unconscious that the only way for it to mirror back is through otherness, other voices, disembodied visuals, those kinds of things. As soon as you look at somebody who's in psychosis, like, what's wrong with you? Like, oh, or you have that kind of reaction, it actually drives them deeper into the psychosis, because what you're doing is you're driving the parallel reality that they're in, and the difference between your reality and their reality, you're driving that gap even wider. So the best thing that you can do is to meet them where they are and get that person to start listening to what, not like saying, yes, the voices are true, yes, you should kill yourself, or whatever these voices are saying, but get them to start to see that those voices are actually them. And unfortunately, it's not like that person was born that way, right? We know that. It's a coping mechanism. So if you're somebody who's struggling, I really encourage you to seek out different kinds of therapists, like somatic therapists, who will work with the physiological responses in the body. Completion process practitioners, we're actually going back and doing the same thing. We're altering the physical response by reliving the experience and then altering and meeting the needs, creating the experience that was never there to begin with. And there's science behind this. Like, it's really effective, and I've seen it work. Absolute miracles. If you guys have any questions or any comments about this video, I would love to see them down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you guys for all the new followers, like 400 new followers in the last month or something. So I really appreciate that. And I look forward to sharing more content with you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.